Okay, so cut off again. Not that it matters. So, got a few things left to say. So, we sort of left off talking about the kind of media, the basic fact, kind of like we're being misinformed about the Russia-Ukraine war, and we're kind of being biasedly misinformed to a degree or another about this war. Um, Obviously, it's been reported a lot more, but we're saying the same things time and time again. And this is the point. It's like actually in all the critical issues in particularly Western culture, but more widely culture, like what's going on in the world, the media are retelling the same story. It's the same narrative. Um, it's like the messaging system's the same and the playbook is the same. And we've seen it particularly politically in the past. This is why America's a great place to look because it's very transparent what is going on at a fundamental level, which is why it's kind of heightened, really. Um, you could think to yourself, why is everything 10 times as much in America? Because um, America's kind of the heat map of this kind of what is really known as the culture wars. This is the point. I think what we're seeing now is an unveiling of the kind of the forces around the earth and spiritual forces as well. If you kind of in the concept of Daniel, is it 14:15, where the angel comes down and tells him about the spiritual warfare. So there's a literal physical um, sort of ruler of Persia, but there's actually a demonic ruler of Persia that actually in the spiritual realm rules Persia and affects the physical realm of Persia. That's what kind of the revelation to Daniel is. But it's basically the same. As I said, the same. It's the same messaging system giving the same playbook like it's a game. And we're seeing the same in the news media across this war. So what we're being seen is like, and this is the one of the actual real problems with the pro-Palestinian. So they get some person of Muslim or Palestinian heritage who's been Western educated and has been educated in all these kind of concepts, the mindsets, and they just repeat the playbook and the messaging. So Israel basically being bombarded with the same message by the news media. What do you make of the death and the destruction in Gaza and the killing of kids and babies and stuff? And they're commenting on it. It's like, well, however you like or don't like those comments, they are commenting it, saying like, well, basically they're a nation under attack, and you have to think Jewish mindset in their minds. Like this is an existential crisis if we don't respond in like it's us that are up for genocide, not them. And then you do it to the media asks the same questions to someone of, as I said, sort of Palestinian, Muslim, sort of Arab heritage, who is Western educated, and they refuse to answer. Time and again, they refuse to answer. And the kind of, I'm not talking to genocidal maniacs. They're like, pull these great big phrases out of the sky that just are so big they don't not actually true. And in their mindset, there is no reason to actually ask that question. That's the actual reasoning. It's not even a legitimate question in their own thinking. They're kind of sort of legitimizing the genocide that will be done to Israel in their own paradigm or worldview. So it's actually to them not a legitimate question, which is why they won't answer it. And obviously, the truth is, if they answered it, they'll find what they're accusing Israel of that they want to do to Israel. Yeah, and it's kind of a whole. There is a real mindset that's related to that in terms of competing cultural values between sort of traditional and non-traditional values, and there's a whole thing to get into that, but you have to bear that in mind, and that's kind of alarming. And there's all sorts of things we're being told in the media and we're being shown by the media, and It's all quite actually very scary. Naturally, I mean, I can tell you my experience. So I'm getting bombarded by pictures inside Gaza. So going back to that Indian chap, one of the insights he gave is like, and he actually put it like this. He's like, well, forget what I think. I've actually been to Gaza. I've seen it with my own eyes, and it's basically a terrorist state. And the people within Gaza are being run by terrorists. He's like, he even gave the example, when you're married, you're not actually in a marriage because you're not sure if you say something that is anti the government, which is anti-Hamas, which is anti-terrorist, that your wife or your husband isn't going to snitch on you. And it's like, that's the reality for Gazans. So we're actually what's being educated to us is a sort of half-true picture. Yes, there is this stuff going on, but there's no reasoning why. And then we're getting bombarded by these pictures. Again, the question is, like, all these people that are recording these pictures for, news media like the BBC always seem to be in the right place at the right time, always showing the right bodies and the right destruction. It's part of the apparatus of Hamas, actually, which is what this guy was saying. It's like this is how they operate. And actually, they don't have much choice what they do or don't report. They don't really work for the BBC. They work for Hamas. Because if Hamas didn't like them, they wouldn't be there. And if Hamas really didn't like them, they wouldn't be alive. They'd be dead. And that's the sort of environment they live in. And there's lots going on. As I said before, it's a fog. It's meant to confuse. It's meant to paralyze us so we get the wrong opinion. So there's all this stuff going on. So if we go back to the point, and I think this probably might be one of my final points if I actually finish this. So we've been on a long journey discovering all this stuff, been discussing it. So what is the real problem for the West? Well, the real problem for the West, and particularly for America, is it's using Ukraine to fight a proxy war. So it's on one side of the proxy war, but then it's having a proxy war for not just against Israel, but against the West, and particularly America, by Iran. So it's in two different wars, it's on different sides. And it's playing one side in one war, and in the other war, the same side's getting played against it. And this is the problem. So it goes back to these two Muslim types, two types of Islam that are being adopted in the Middle East. And it's bigger than just one side against the other. I mean, when does that ever get discussed? It's an obvious reality. So if you actually understand the real picture, so Iran are fighting a proxy war on behalf of their type of Islam against the other type of Islam. So Iran have proxy forces in the following countries. So they have them in what the Palestinians call Palestine with Hamas. They have them in Hezbollah, but they also have them in Syria. They also have them in Iran, and they also have them in Yemen with the Houthis. So that's what, 6 nations, including Iran, involved in some kind of war, including actual war with guns and weapons and the whole shebang, against the rest of the Middle East, including Israel, ironically. So it's why the likes of Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Egypt tend to actually side with Israel, because they understand actually politically and quasi even religiously, like the threat for them doesn't come from Israel, it comes from Iran. So you can imagine that, well, imagine in your head all the different nations, and then you realise 6 of those nations are on one side, and then the others are on the rest. So the Houthis have said so that the Houthis are the rebels in Yemen. They've said that they're basically in a war with Israel for whatever reason, despite they're rebels in Houthi, and they're firing ballistic missiles. So there was a story yesterday I heard of the first space, how would you, it's mental. It's like the first kind of space fight or Star Wars war in space ever in the history of humanity. And basically, the Houthis, who are the rebels in Yemen again, fire. So where do they get a ballistic missile? They fire a ballistic missile up into the edge of space, or wherever, but high up in the atmosphere, around space. I think really is kind of the edge of the atmosphere, and it was intercepted by a Israeli self-defense weapon in space. So it's like we're clearly approaching new territory here. So you've got this type of weapon now, dangerous. You've got a rebel group in a country that they don't politically exist. They're not a political power. They're not in power. They're not a government at this point. And they've got ballistic missiles. Where do they get the ballistic missiles from? There are proxy force of Iran in Yemen fighting the Yemenese government. They get them from Iran. And the whole point of proxy war is you can fight a war against the people you don't like and you don't receive any of the comeback. It's what the Americans are doing to the Russians in Ukraine, and this is what really hacks off Putin. He constantly says lots of things. Basically, he's saying fundamentally this will be done. Like, why are they continuing it, and what the hell are they doing? And stop getting involved. And that seems to be a psychological warfare carried out in the news between Russia and America. So actually, quite a lot of what Putin then saying about the war in Ukraine between Ukraine and Russia is directed at the Americans. And as we've discussed, they are continuing it. So if you take that wider step back in the Middle East, that's actually the picture you get. It's much bigger than just the Palestinians versus the Jews, or Hamas versus Israel, or however you want to phrase it or term it or coin it. It's quite a serious existential crisis in the Middle East, and this is where it's moving forwards to. And what you realise with the Iran's proxy forces is they're all in the north. The entire north of the Middle East is where these terrorist groups are fighting. The two exceptions would be Hamas in the Gaza Strip and the Houthis in Yemen. Yemen's right down to the south. But I think it's true to say, so someone fired some rockets at Saudi Arabia and destroyed some infrastructure to do with oil. And that was the Houthis as well. Pretty certain that's true. But there's all sorts of stuff going on, and it's why these groups don't like each other, fundamentally speaking. And actually, the guy who's in charge of Saudi Arabia, the prince, called the guy in charge of Iran Hitler. I mean, that's how serious it is, and that's how much they don't like each other, that they hate each other. So it's kind of, you've got this Jews versus Muslims things going on, but actually you've got this other thing where it's just very different from that, is Muslims versus Muslims, and some of the Muslims are more on the Jewish side than they are on the other Muslim side. That's the actual reality. So the actual reality for countries, particularly Jordan and Saudi Arabia and even Egypt, is like, if Hamas succeeds and these proxy forces of Iran get a foothold in Israel, say in the West Bank, like they're much closer by a long way to being next on the hit list, because they then start to be surrounded by these countries. They're not these forces and these powers, that Iran and its proxy forces, not to the north. Also, you've got to understand the issue here is with Turkey as well, which is also in the north, does quite a lot of saber rattling. I saw something again on YouTube, I think it was 2 days ago. So Erdogan, who is the president of Turkey, who kind of, that whole situation is just really bizarre, because it's like not dual personality to one person and different personality to another. It's like got 3 or 4 different personalities, different people. But obviously one of those political personalities is to do with Turkey and what's going on with Turkey. One's got to do with being a Muslim state and surrounded by Muslims, and ironically, like, what's he a member of? NATO. So when we say military, America and allies and the West, we're basically NATO, which Turkey is part of. So anyway, Erdogan does loads and loads of saber rattling to the West, despite the fact he's part of the West militarily. Um, Apparently, someone put up something quite disturbing of like rioting around Turkish bases. This base actually had a nuke in it because the Americans apparently have distributed their nuclear weapons to NATO allies for the protection of NATO. So you've got this stuff going on. It's like, you realise it is really scary. But as I said, the whole point is to be informed. So that's kind of my perspective. I don't think I've forgotten. Have I forgotten anything? Probably forgotten a few bits, but we'll probably cover them anyway. But the idea is to go deeper into some of the stuff we planned to do before, which we've had to pause. As I said, wanted to go into the Ukraine war a lot more and actually what's happening on the ground. But got sidelined by suddenly, literally, I think it was the Friday, and I was going to do a video on the Monday on the Ukraine-Russia war, and literally on the Saturday was when the Hamas attack began, and then the whole war has been again fogged by just the whole entire world and the media get involved in commenting on it. So we've had quite a lot of stuff to discuss and to basically put on the ground and say this is it. But we will move forwards. As I said, we will try and explain some stuff and lay out some proper videos where you're not just listening to me talking, but we like look at stuff, properly analyse stuff, look at the evidence, do some of the biblical analysis as well. So like I said, it would be good to do the Ukraine war at some point, but it seems to be unimportant at the moment. Now, one thing Kim Clement prophesied was, I think he was talking about China actually, or it might have been Iran. I think it's pretty China, them aching for a new kind of war, and I think that has many different facets. But when you look at the Ukraine war and you understand actually what's going on between Ukraine and Russia, you realise it's dominated by drones that you can basically buy off Amazon or other websites available if you don't like buying stuff from Amazon. It's a bit scary, really. It kind of almost keeps this entire status quo going. And if you understand that, understanding this new war was a bit scary because, like, Hamas clearly have some of those weapons. It's like, well, do they have a lot of those weapons? How many of those weapons do they have? And they actually going to be able to use them? That was kind of my question I was answering it. And the answer appears to be no, they're not really using them because of the nature of the war. Actually, they might be highly organised at the beginning, but they're not organised anymore. Or we'd see loads of drones up in the Gaza Strip fighting against Israeli forces, or Israeli tanks, Israeli infantry, not men. Don't seem to have the capacity to do that. So basically, the whole point is, if you have that capacity to fight using drones, and again, you buy them off for up to between £300 and £1,000 off various sites. I mean, just Google FPV drones. They're basically drones with cameras where you fix a grenade to them. They fly and you can drop the grenade, bang, go get another grenade. So the beauty then is, like, if that's your military strategy and you're having the enemy take out those drones, they're not human beings and it's cheap. So that's how partly the Ukraine-Russia war has been fought out. So all the classic stuff, but drones. And drones are really keeping the status quo because you can just have like a billion, literally, if you've got a billion people flying a billion drones up in the air with cameras, like nothing can move. And it's a new kind of war. And it's one that I don't think the West are particularly able to defend against. It's sort of equalising.